Welcome on in, golf fans. It's your boy Gsluke here with our DFS and betting preview for this week's Houston Open. Gonna get you guys ready for all of your exposure. With first off, a look at my modeling and key stats for this week, what I'm using to identify some of my top plays, and afterwards we're gonna go through the DFS and betting side of things with a few bets that I've already taken to this point, some top 5 and top 10s as well as my DFS core plays and values down towards the bottom end of the board to help you save some salary out there in your lineups. And by the end, you'll be an expert on what to expect this week and ready to get all of your research process started. So without further ado, let's go ahead and hop on in. But first off, a look at my modeling for this week and what I'm looking for out there in my exposure. This golf course is already a long one, nearly 7,500 yards for a par 70, but with some rain expected Thursday, Friday, it could play even longer here in 2025. So it's a course we are already looking at a lot of iron shots from 175 plus, but off the tee distance and club head speed could really come into play this year. So you're going to see an extra emphasis on some of the bombers in our exposure, partially because of the weather they're expecting for rounds 1 and 2. Around the green comes into play at a more difficult golf course like this. It's a lengthy par 70, so scoring usually stays pretty much in check, so bogey avoidance, something you might want to look at as well. And with your putting stats, you do have some overseeded greens this week. And par 5 scoring, it is a weird par 70. It's worth noting that there are 5 par 3s around here and 3 par 5s as well. That's how you get to that par 70 number. So you might want to look at that as well, because that's where a majority of your birdie looks are going to come. In terms of comp courses, I've got Augusta National as one of the best ones you can choose from. Pinehurst number 2, so the home of the US Open last year. And then also Country Club of Jackson, which is where you're going to get a much larger sample size than some of these other events. I will say that it's only really the elite tier players that you're going to see over there at the Masters, right? Only a 1-year sample there at the US Open, but where you can find a lot of these players in the field this week would be at Country Club of Jackson. So all 3 of these venues where you're going to see a lot of mid to long irons. Top 2 pretty much spot in line with the difficulty that you're going to get this week. Maybe a hair harder, right? Because they're major championships. Sanderson Farms, much easier scoring wise, also a par 72, but a lot of the same kind of shots that you have across each venue. So those are a few comp courses, a few key stats that you can incorporate into your modeling. And what you'll get in terms of like the top players this week is you want ball striking and then putting out there on that overseed. It's a grinded out sort of event. You don't see really birdie or better percentage out here in a lot of these stats, and you don't see a lot of the things that we look for at Birdie Fest out here in this model, right? It's the bogey avoidance. Even around the green at number 3 is a lot higher than what we typically have because the scoring's a little bit harder to come by. And I think with that rain, with the golf course playing maybe longer here this year, I think the scoring can actually be harder than what we usually see. And a lot of times when we have a soft course, we talk about conditions maybe getting easier, but if it's at a course that was already stretching the limits when it comes to length, you got to think it's 5 par 3s as well, right? It plays effectively even longer than that 7,500 yards, and that's going to be an even bigger factor this year. So of course, right, those are some of the stats that I'm looking at for the exact model weightings that I'm taking over there in my model. You can find those over there on the Patreon version. Of course, you can join the Patreon via the link in the description of the video. But over there on Bet the Number, you can go out there and make your own model for this week. So you can take the key stats here that you agree with the most, the ones that you want to lean into to go out there and build your player pool, and customize that all over there on Bet the Number. So make sure to check them out as well if you guys haven't already. Of course, the sponsor of this video here. But now that we've gone through all the modeling, what to expect from this golf tournament, now let's shift our focus over there to our exposure and some of our top plays of the week. Our top spend up is going to be Rory McIlroy at $11,700, who in DFS has definitely got the price tag to account for his talent level, but at plus 750, I think some slight value in terms of winning this event because he's my number 1 total model ranking play. I've got his projected made cut rate at nearly 97%, and he's won twice this calendar year, right? So I don't think it's a hot take to say that you think he can win again, but this golf course fits his game to a T, and if we get that rain over there on Thursday, Friday, in these weather forecasts, they change a whole bunch on us, right? Just look at last week for a prime example of that. But if it is going to be a softer 2025 event, then Rory McIlroy would be at a massive advantage. Already one of the longest carry distance players that we have in the field, and we know that at long, soft golf courses that Rory McIlroy is capable of dominating. So with the kind of form that he's seen lately, right, it's not a hot take to see him at the top of this list, gaining across all 4 stat categories. In fact, if you take a look at the last 24 rounds, so actually zoom out a little bit out there on Rory, he's the best player that you have in this field, gaining close to a stroke per round off the tee, still into the positive across all 4 categories, and on this overseed in particular has been borderline dominant this year. You can see he's not that much better than his 24-round baseline, but is gaining close to 0.6 strokes per round out there on the greens, and we'll see what the conditions look like as we get closer to lock, but even on a dry golf course around this type of track, I think he's got a real good chance to post a top finish, though he doesn't have the event history to really look at. Right, guys like Scottie Scheffler have multiple top 10s over the last 3 years. Rory McIlroy, I'd argue, probably has that same sort of course history as a Scottie if he had played here a bunch, if not better, because of how the course fit is. He is, one of the longer players, as we've already outlined, but also one of the better iron players that you have from 175 to 225, and that's really where a key proximity bucket will be for this week. That 175 to 200, also that 200 to 225 range are going to have extra emphasis over there in my modeling. And that's part of the reason why he etches out a Scottie Scheffler in terms of that total model ranking, but also that putting over there on the overseed. So he's the guy that I'll be trying to get the most exposure to up top. Not to say that I won't play some Scottie Scheffler as well. Even if you do get over the field on a Rory, right, I could still have some lineups out there with Scottie as well. I think both of them, right, more than, adequate to have that sort of price tag in this field. But I like what DraftKings did. They priced up these two in particular way above what you had with the rest of the field, and they could have easily put Scottie at like 12K, maybe Rory at like 11.5 like they had done for a while, and then had some of these players here in like the 10K range, that sort of thing, but it wouldn't have been proper pricing, right? Those guys would have been way overpriced for the kind of upside that they had, and now there's nearly a $2,000 gap, right, from Rory down to JJ Spawn here at third. I think that's exactly what it should have been all along. So I like the way that they set up the pricing with these two in the field, but of those top 2 players, Rory's my favorite out there at plus 750. Next up, we got our first top 5 bet. I did not bet him outright at this point because the number was not right over there on Hard Rock Bet, but I do like Tony Finau at this course, and if you like event history, right, you don't get that with Rory. Well, it's the exact opposite with Tony Finau, and in fact, that's almost the whole reason to go out there and play him this week. He has 3 top 25 finishes in his 4 starts here, but the most notable, of course, coming over the last 2 seasons, where Tony went runner-up last year, and then, of course, won it back there in 2023. So a player that has shown us that top-level upside before, and the thing that's great about Tony Finau is that his lead-in form hasn't always been great, and that's kind of the case right now. If you take a look at his lead-in form, he is slightly losing over his last 12 measured rounds, which puts him at number 63 in the field when it comes to that recent form. But if you take a look at when he won this, and even when he finished in second last year, it's not like he's always blown it up during the Florida swing, right? He's the kind of guy that, like, at best, maybe top 10s at the Players, like maybe goes out there and top 10s at the API, and more often than not, right, he's finishing outside the top 25 in a lot of those Florida swing events. So it's not like you have to take this guy when he's coming into form here, because he's shown us in the past that this is a spot that he feels very comfortable at, and he's able to go out there and find a little bit of a bounce back. So the putting on overseed, not the greatest, but you've seen him at this golf course in particular go out there and run the tables. He did so in the year that went out there and won. And even last year, right, he was solid out there on the greens. If he goes out there and has a solid week over there tee to green, right, even if we don't have a spike week with the putter, which I would say is it's a thing that's going to be the hardest part, right, of getting him out there into that top 3 or winning, would be going out there and getting him to gain like 3 or 4 shots gained to the field putting. But even if he only gains, let's say he's neutral, or maybe gains like 1 stroke to the field over his 4 rounds, if he's elite ball striking, right, that could get us that top 5 at plus 770. So that's why I decided to go in that direction, especially with the outright number at only the 30 to 1 over there at Hard Rock Bet. But in DFS, he will not be chalky, and that's really where I think the upside comes in and playing him in your fantasy lineups. You've got guys around him like Wyndham that are playing a little bit better golf, even Sungjae Im that form-wise, it's actually maybe a little bit worse for Sungjae, but I think a lot of people would rather play a Sungjae this week than get to a Tony Finau. I think there's a good chance that Finau's maybe like 12 to 14% owned, I'd say at the very most, for DFS this week. And if he's in that lower teens range when it comes to that ownership, then I'm going to be at least double the field, at least 25% of my exposure, if not closer to that 35 to 40% mark, because, I mean, that elite tier course history, he's the perfect course fit on a week like this. I mean, long bomber, really good with those mid to long irons. I know the putting on overseed lately hasn't been up to par, but at this golf course, right, he's gone a lot to fall over the last few years. He's got and especially on a softer golf course, right? If it's going to play longer than usual, it is only a positive out there for a bomber like Tony Finau. So the kind of player that I'll be getting well over the field on. And I think even from the outright market, we'll have to see what the outright number looks like as we get closer to lock on Thursday. Maybe I'll take a dabble on him if he gets to like 40-1 or something like that. Next up, we got Taylor Pendrith down here at $8,500. I bet him for a top 10 at plus 425. And really from the modeling perspective, he's just the poster child for this week. In fact, if you take a look at the Bet the Number model, they have Scotty Scheffler as their number one player there. Not a surprise whatsoever. But number 2, Taylor Pendrith, which might be a surprise because I think a lot of models are going to have either Rory number 1 or Rory number 2 out there in those sort of lists. But Pendrith, especially with this overseeding putting, checks every single box that you could possibly hope for. So the long-term fit, you can see he's number 4 out there in the field. The recent form metrics actually aren't very strong out there for Pendrith, but if you take a look at the last 24 rounds in particular, you'll see what the upside is, right? I mean, just a flusher off the tee, gaining close to 0.75 per round, gaining close to a half a stroke per round over there on approach, and the last 12 have gone ugly, right? There's been some missed cuts out there for a Pendrith, and the short game has really fallen off over those last 12 round sample size, but on this overseed and on these type of greens in particular, he's been one of the best players that you have in this field. In fact, compared to his 24 round baseline, he's a shot and a half better per round on this overseed than what we're used to seeing. So $8,500 got the off the tee distance that you'd be hoping for as well. One of the longest players that we have in this field from 175 to 225 is one of the most accurate iron players that we have in this field as well. That's why he's a top 5 course ranking, right? Because of all those different things that we're looking for, pretty much being top 5, top 10 in most of those categories is elite tier stuff. So I do think he'll get some ownership down here in this range, but with Bridgman's form, right, people try and play him. Michael Kim is projecting out really well out there in my personal projections. I'm sure others, right, are going to be pumping him out there as well. A Steven Yeager at $8,800, right, here's your champion from last year. Even a Matt McNeely, right, he's probably too cheap at $8,300. People will play guys like a Grazerman or a Smalley in lineups. I don't see him being this like egregious chalk, like 25% or anything like that. Probably at most, I'd say around 20% owned, and that would be like a worst case scenario, I'd say, on a player like a Taylor Pendrith. That's at least my early lean over here on a Monday, but hopefully, and maybe this is wishful thinking, closer to like 15% ownership. If he's down at that sort of number, I'll play him in 30% of lineups and take at least that 2x leverage. If not, play him in slightly more than that and further add on top of that. Before we go through our value plays, a few more top 10 bets that I wanted added to the card. Do want to remind you where you can find these spreadsheets for yourself. That, of course, is over there on my Patreon page, which you can find in the description of this video. The link to there will take you over there to my site. And if you want these, make sure you join the DFS tier. On there for just $15 a month, you not only get access to every single thing that you see on here, that's projections, ownership, modeling for every single player, shots gained metrics, form, also course history out there for every player teeing it up. You get all of that and all the showdown stuff for rounds 2 through 4. So that's just the DFS tier. Of course, I have some prop stuff and betting stuff that I post as well. If you're on the underdog and price pick side, you might want to check out that sort of stuff as well. But for these spreadsheets, that's what the DFS tier is for. So make sure to check it out in the description of this video, as I said before, not only to get access to my take on every single player, but also to support the channel, right? Helps me out with doing all this content, doing this full time for you guys, being able to go through and spend all the time it takes to go out there, adjust these models, make them as accurate as humanly possible. It's a win-win situation out there. So make sure to check it out if you guys haven't already. But now that the plug is done, let's go through the last few plays for this week, which we've got 3. One more outright bet and a few more top 10s out there too. So it's our last outright bet here with Nicolai Højgaard, who I got at 100-1. That was a little bit of a sprinkle. I just thought the number was disrespectful out there for Nico. By the end of the week, by the way, I'm going to have more than 2 outright bets. It's just that the odds on Hard Rock Bet were absolute trash. So, I'm not going to force in any exposure unless they're giving me a fair line. By the time we get to Wednesday, though, there's probably going to be a lot more attractive odds to go out there and take. So, of course, guys, right on the Patreon, I'll be posting all those outright bets that I'm adding out there as well. But Højgaard, my main bet for this week would be this top 10 at plus 800. He's a top 20 mono ranking play. He did miss the cut for us last week, which was heartbreaking. I had him in like 30% of my lineup. So it was far from ideal, we'd say, right out there at the Players Championship, at the Valspar Championship as well. I believe he's gone back-to-back missed cuts. Like I said, sub-ideal out there for Nico, but the upside is still there in the modeling. In fact, fact, if you take a look at my custom modeling, even with these 2 missed cuts, right, he's still top 20 in the field. In the Bet the Number model, he's top 10 in the field, right, despite having those 2 missed cuts. So you're talking about somebody that has all the off the tee distance that you need at this sort of golf course. He's got the mid to long irons down pat as well, one of the best players from 175 to 225 yards. Maybe not the best overseeding putting, so that's probably the one metric that leaves a little bit to be desired, right? He's not like a Pendrith that is a ball striker and is gaining over there with the overseed stats, but for a top 10, we don't need him to gain 5-6 shots gained putting. If he were to get us into the 2-3 shots gained range, that would probably be enough with how elite of a ball striker he is. And even with the 2 missed cuts, this is one I'm going to show you out here with Højgaard. I mean, look at the stats. He's still gaining a stroke per round. He's still gaining half a stroke per round over there with the irons. The off the tee play has been the problem, right? He was missing far too many fairways out there in the Florida swing, which you do that at the Players, it's water balls. You do at the Valspar, you're in the tree lines, right? And you're screwed going out there and trying to make a par. This week, it's a wide open Muni course. There's hardly any trees out there on the venue, and it's 1-inch rough, essentially no rough, right? Out there on the entire golf course. There's only 2 driving holes where there's water in play, and they're both down the right side. You're telling me that for the other 11 tee shots that he has, right, he can't keep himself out of trouble? I think it's maybe the perfect setup out there for Nicolai Højgaard, right? And Steven Jaeger's the same way, right? He can't keep the ball on planet Earth. He gained all that distance, and his accuracy went to absolute shit. Højgaard's the same way, right? He gives up that accuracy to go out there and hit it a long way. This is just a match made in heaven for these sort of players. So you're going to see that same kind of trend out there with the last 2 players that we're getting to. But these long bombers, especially if it's a softer week, right? If it's going to play even longer than usual, are an even bigger advantage around this sort of golf course. So 100 to 1, you know, you're telling me we play this event 100 times, at least with this current form. Nicolai is winning it at least one of those times. In fact, I probably think he wins it closer to 4 or 5 times. At least 2-3 times, I'd say, maybe more conservatively out there with Højgaard, but that's the idea with going out there and betting him. And then our last 2, so let's go with Aldrich Potgieter first, who we took here for a top 10 at plus 1,200. So 12 to 1 to top 10, I think disrespectful given what we've seen from him. When this guy is on, when this guy has a good week, it's usually that top 5, top 10 upside. And just like we mentioned with the Højgaard, it being a wide open golf course, that is exactly what we need for a Potgieter. Right, we need it to be a course where there's not a whole bunch of hazards in play, not a whole bunch of trees where you can get yourself into trouble, because if it's the same penalty to miss a fairway by 1 yard as it is to go out there and miss it by 20-25, it's the perfect course for a Potgieter. And there's a few examples of that, right? You've got courses like the Farmers that he nearly won at, which is an example of that. That's got super deep rough, but it's the same length, 1 foot off the fairway as it is 20-30 yards off the fairway as well. So it doesn't really matter how accurate you are at a course like that, at least if you're not like a hyper accurate guy. If you're hitting all the fairways, that's great, but hardly anyone's doing that, right? Around the Farmers, he can fit that style golf course, but he also played well at Mexico, right? Wide open kind of resort style course with no rough. That's the kind of golf course that we have this week. So that's why I played in Aldrich. And if you take a look at the recent form metrics, I mean, he's been rather impressive. I mean, we know the off the tee is always going to be there, but he's been even better with the putter. The guy's just been making everything out there, which sometimes would be an issue, but he just looks like a really damn good putter. You can tell watching the kid from the eye test that he's probably going to gain strokes putting every year that he's out here on tour. And the iron play's been there too. I mean, you would think with all these really good looks that he's given himself, and by the way, there is correlation between having really good off the tee play and it being a little bit harder to go out there and gain strokes on approach. I mean, if you're somebody, for example, like Kisner, that's way behind the 8 ball on every tee shot that he hits, and then hits a pretty decent approach shot to like 15-20 feet, you're going to gain a shit ton of strokes on approach in that sort of situation. It's harder to go out there and gain on approach when you're hitting the ball 400 yards off the tee on every single hole. So guys like Aldrich that are still into the positive into that category, I think had a massive advantage this week. And Aldrich has been a lot better with his around the green shots when you've had him on fairway as opposed to deep rough or out of bunkers. And at this golf course where they have hardly any greenside bunkers, there's hardly any rough around the greens either. That is another reason that Aldrich could really fit this course well. So it's mostly the off the tee. I think it's disrespectful to say that, you know, if you played this event 12 times, that he's not going to at least top 10, 2, maybe even 3 times out of that sample size. And the recent form's been there too. So at $6,800, he's going to save you a lot of salary if you need to spend up for somebody like a Rory or a Scotty Scheffler. And I still think he has that top end upside that you're looking for. And then the last player we're going to go through here is going to be a Thurston Lawrence at $6,400. Who he is eventually going to wake up this year. I can promise you that. He is an extremely talented player coming over from the DP World Tour. Heck, He almost won the Open Championship last year, if you guys were watching that. And he's super cheap, essentially unowned. No one's going to use him this week because of his form. And I took him for a top 10 at plus 2,500, which 25 to 1 out there, and him to go out there in top 10 is as disrespectful as it gets. If you took a look at his track record on the DP World Tour last year, he finished second on the entire tour, only to a Rory McIlroy. So of the guys that actually played there the entire year, he was the best player that you had coming from over there. And I mean, we've had guys from the DP World Tour come over like Pavon and win, McIntyre win multiple times, other guys getting into contention, top 5, top 10s all the time out here in tour. Thurston, if you take a look at his track record compared to those other players, he is way better than all of those sort of players. So for him to be $6,400, I mean, this is truly the lowest that you're ever going to see him priced out here on tour. This is the kind of guy that I see winning a tour event over the next 2-3 seasons, getting his tour card locked up for life, or at least for the next 2-3 years after that, right? With getting those sort of exemptions, he's that type of player. And what you normally see with Lawrence over there on the DP World Tour, and this will probably translate over to the PGA Tour as well, is that when he plays bad, he misses cuts horribly. Kind of like what he's done towards the start of this year. But when he has his best stuff, it's oftentimes a top 5, a top 10, or even a near win over there on the DP World Tour. So he's an extremely long player, loves to hit drivers off the tee, and his main bugaboo to start this year has been the driving accuracy, and bleeding strokes in that category. Also, maybe hasn't been the best over there on the greens or with the irons, but I know the long-term pedigree of this sort of player, a player that I've really been following for quite some time. And in DFS, right, there are other guys down here that are bombers that you can take a shot on that, you know, they might be like 0.5 to 1% owned out there in lineups. Even if you only used them in 3% of your 150 max builds, that's leverage to the field right there. Now, I usually go like at least 4 to 5% on these sort of players down low. A guy like Thurston that I'm also betting for their top 25, right? Maybe I play him closer to like 7, maybe 10% in lineups, especially because he's somebody that I threw out of my content this week, right? Out here for you guys to ponder going out there and playing yourself. Those sort of players I'm going to be a little bit more aggressive on in general, but you don't have to play these guys on a ton of lineups to get that leverage, right? Like if you're just throwing them into your pool because, you know, you agree with me out here on this sort of take, 2 to 3% could be enough to go out there and get that leverage. So there are quite a few guys down here that I'll be taking that sort of shot on. And from the outright betting perspective, the top 10 at plus 2,500, that is, like I said, there's a reason why it was the first bet that I went out there and threw in this week. That is, I love to look at Thurston's odds. Like I said, he's one of my favorite players out there in the world, but he realistically should probably be closer to like plus 1,500 at the very most. And that's considering that he's in some of the worst form that you've ever seen. Plus 2,500 is like, okay, I'm buying the dip. Let's see what ends up happening here if we can get that bounce back. And if so, it's going to have a ton of leverage out there in our GPP lineups and a hell of a top 10 bet there, 25 to 1. Alrighty, guys, that is all I've got for the DFS and betting preview. Go ahead and smash the like button if you guys haven't already, and also subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of the content to come. Of course, we already got our course breakdown up, so if you guys haven't already caught that, make sure to check it out. There's a link in the description to go out there and watch that. But we've also got our weekly live stream Wednesday at 7 p.m. Eastern time, going through any of your questions that you have down there in the chat, as well as some ownership, a weather report for rounds 1 and 2, maybe if there's any strategy just targeting one wave versus the other. We'll go through some contest selection, lineup construction as well, and your underdog and prize picks exposure for round 1. So make sure to stop on by for that. Again, Wednesday at 7 p.m. Eastern time. But on top of that, I also need you guys to comment down below what you've got as the winner for this week. And if they are at least 30 to 1 to go out there and win, and I think that's most of the guys, right, outside of Scotty and Rory. So don't take one of those two. They won't count for you. But if you can give me the winner out there for this event, you will win a free month access to my Patreon page. So go ahead, claim your player down below, because it's a first come, first serve basis. Once a player's taken once, they cannot be guessed again. So make sure that your guy hasn't already been taken. And hey, if you're one of the first guys to go out there and watch this video, one of the more hardcore fans of the channel, it pays off to be early. So best of luck out there with the contest, with any exposure that you guys are going with this week. I'll see you guys for that Wednesday live stream at 7 p.m. And let's try and take down a few contests and maybe cash an outright bet on a Rory or a Nico.